Before the tank ever existed as a machine of steel and oil, it existed as an idea, written down in a magazine 13 years before a single one ever rolled onto a battlefield. In December of 1903, just months after the Wright brothers took their first flight, a British writer named H.G. Wells published a short story called The Land Ironclads. In it, he described massive armored vehicles, nearly 100 feet long, rolling across a stalemated battlefield on all-terrain wheels, immune to rifle fire, carrying riflemen inside through gun ports, with a raised lookout tower on top. The story was published in the Strand magazine, a publication widely read at the time by British military officers. 13 years later, almost exactly what Wells imagined, rolled out of a factory in England and onto the battlefields of the First World War. This is the real history of the tank. Not just the machines, but the secrets, the failures, the strange twists of fate, and the almost unbelievable coincidences that shaped one of the most important weapons ever built. From a piece of fiction written before airplanes had even properly taken off, to a Cold War-era design still shaping how tanks are built on the other side of the world today. This is a story that spans more than 120 years, 4 continents, and some of the most consequential wars in modern history. And most of the details in it never make it into the popular version most people already think they know. It's a history full of moments most people have never heard, because the popular version of this story usually skips straight to the famous machines, the Tiger, the Sherman, the T-34, without ever explaining how strange, chaotic, and improvised the actual invention of this weapon really was. The truth is messier, more human, and in some ways more remarkable than the clean version most documentaries tell. Let's start at the beginning. By 1915, the First World War had become a nightmare of stalemate. Trenches stretched for hundreds of miles across the Western Front. Machine guns and barbed wire had turned open ground into a killing field. Neither side could advance without suffering catastrophic losses. Something new was desperately needed, a machine that could cross trenches, crush barbed wire, and shrug off bullets while still moving forward. Winston Churchill, decades before he would become Britain's wartime Prime Minister, was, at this point, First Lord of the Admiralty. And it was Churchill who personally created and chaired a small group called the Landships Committee, tasked with building exactly this kind of machine before the year was out. The project was kept under total secrecy, and the cover story the British government invented to protect it is the reason this weapon has the name it has today. Workers building the very first prototypes were told they were constructing mobile water containers for the front lines. The crates the finished machines were shipped in were literally stenciled with a single word: tank. It was supposed to be temporary cover, just enough to confuse German intelligence long enough to get the weapon into the field. The name was never changed back. It became permanent. Every army on Earth, in every language, has called this weapon a tank ever since, because of a lie that was never corrected. The very first working prototype to come out of this secret program had an oddly personal name. It was nicknamed Little Willie, a mocking jab at the German Crown Prince, Wilhelm. When a second, improved prototype was built, it was first nicknamed Big Willie, mocking the Kaiser himself, before eventually being renamed Mother. Mother became the direct template for the Mark I, the very first tank in history to see actual combat. And here's a strange little postscript. Little Willie still exists. It's the oldest surviving individual tank in the entire world, sitting today in the Tank Museum in Bovington, England. It came shockingly close to being destroyed. In 1940, during a British scrap metal drive for the war effort, Little Willie was almost melted down for parts before being saved at the last possible moment. So, when did the tank first go to war? September 15th, 1916. The Battle of Flers-Courcelette, part of the larger Battle of the Somme. and what happened that day is almost never talked about honestly. Most people assume the tank's debut was a triumphant, game-changing moment. The real numbers tell a very different story. 49 tanks were shipped to the front that day. Only 32 of them were even mechanically capable of reaching the starting line. Of those, only 25 actually began moving forward with the attack. And of those 25, only 9, fewer than 1 in 5 of the original 49, actually made it all the way across no man's land to reach the German trenches. The rest broke down, got stuck in shell craters, or were simply swallowed by ground that had already been shelled and churned into a moonscape of mud for months. By almost any measure, the tank's combat debut was a mechanical disaster. The Mark I itself, Britain's first combat tank, topped out at a top speed of about 3.5 miles an hour, barely faster than a person walking briskly. Its armor was 10 millimeters thick at the front and just 6 millimeters on the sides, enough to stop a rifle bullet or a piece of shrapnel, but nowhere near enough to stop anything heavier. And the ground it had to cross wasn't just difficult. It was almost the worst possible terrain imaginable. Months of continuous shelling had turned the Somme battlefield into a landscape of deep craters, thick mud, and shattered tree stumps, none of which the earliest tank designs had ever been tested against. And yet, it worked anyway, not because of performance, but because of pure psychological shock. German soldiers who had never seen or imagined anything like these lumbering steel monsters were, by multiple accounts, thrown into genuine panic. British Commander Douglas Haig was impressed enough by what he saw that he immediately ordered hundreds more built. The tank had failed mechanically and succeeded psychologically on the very same afternoon. But surviving inside one of these early machines came with a hidden danger that had nothing to do with enemy fire at all. Early British tanks had catastrophically poor ventilation. Documented British Army medical records from the period describe crews sealed inside their vehicles during combat, developing headaches, dizziness, breathlessness, confusion, collapse, and unconsciousness, all from their own engine's exhaust fumes building up inside the sealed crew compartment. One period medical account states, plainly, that entire crews developed symptoms of carbon monoxide poisoning, quote, even to the extent of becoming unconscious or occasionally demented. Now combine that toxic, oxygen-starved air with interior temperatures that could soar past 50 degrees Celsius in combat, well over 120 degrees Fahrenheit, plus the deafening, constant roar of an unmuffled engine just inches from the crew's heads, plus the terror of fighting almost completely blind through narrow vision slits. Simply riding inside an early tank, doing nothing but existing in that environment for a few hours, was by itself a serious medical ordeal, before a single enemy shell was ever fired at you. And this flaw was never fully solved during the First World War. It was still causing carbon monoxide poisoning among crews as late as 1918, in later models like the Mark V. It's also worth pointing out that Britain wasn't developing this technology in a vacuum. The strange, diamond-shaped hull of those earliest British tanks wasn't a stylistic choice. It was a deliberate engineering solution, specifically shaped to let the vehicle climb up and over the width of a German trench, something a conventional boxy vehicle simply couldn't manage. And Britain wasn't even the only nation racing toward this idea at the same time. France unveiled its own first tank, the Schneider CA-1, just about 1 month after Britain's Mark I prototype was first demonstrated to the army. The tank wasn't handed down from a single genius inventor to the rest of the world. It was closer to a simultaneous competitive arms race happening in parallel among allies who barely knew what the other was building. Now let's jump forward, past the interwar years, into the Second World War, and into one of the strangest, least-known twists in this entire story. Because one of the most important and effective tanks of the entire war exists because of a rejected American inventor. His name was J. Walter Christie, an engineer from New Jersey. Throughout the 1920s and 30s, Christie developed a revolutionary tank suspension system that allowed for extremely high speeds and remarkably smooth movement across rough terrain. Technology that was, in many ways, well ahead of anything the US Army was using at the time. The US Army rejected Christie's designs repeatedly, partly over cost, partly because Christie's philosophy was built around speed over armor. He believed a tank moving fast enough simply wouldn't get hit, and that didn't match existing American military doctrine. Frustrated and effectively shut out at home, Christie started quietly selling his designs abroad instead, to Poland, to Britain, and, most consequentially, to the Soviet Union. His prototype tanks were shipped to Soviet buyers labeled on paper as agricultural tractors, all without official approval from the US government. And that legendary Tiger tank? Fewer than 2,000 were ever built, in total, across the entire war. It's a tiny number compared to the tens of thousands of Shermans and T-34s rolling off Allied production lines. Historians studying this exact question have put it simply. The Allies produced almost 5 times as many tanks as the Axis powers during the war. Overwhelming industrial output, not superior individual engineering, is what ultimately decided the tank war. And on the subject of the Sherman, it's time to correct one of the most widely repeated myths in all of military history. Most American audiences have absorbed this myth from old war movies. The idea that the Sherman tank was a death trap, nicknamed the Ronson, after a cigarette lighter company's supposed slogan, "Lights first time, every time," because it would burst into flames the instant it was hit, unlike the supposedly safer, diesel-powered German tanks. Here's the problem. Almost none of that holds up under real scrutiny. First, the vast majority of German tanks also ran on gasoline, not diesel, so the entire gas versus diesel explanation for Sherman fires is false on its face. Detailed operational research studies, including British wartime combat loss reports, found that tank fires were overwhelmingly caused by ammunition igniting after a hit, not fuel. And this was true for German Panzers and Panthers just as much as it was true for Shermans. Later production Shermans, after the US Army added water-jacketed ammunition storage and moved shells to safer positions inside the hull, are considered by some researchers to have had one of the lowest burn rates of any tank in the entire war. And that famous Ronson advertising slogan, the nickname, is supposedly based on. Researchers who have combed through period Ronson advertisements have never actually found a single wartime ad using that exact phrase. The myth may be almost entirely invented. It's also worth remembering just how widely the Sherman actually served. It became the second most produced tank of the entire Second World War, with roughly 40,000 built, and it was the only Allied tank used by virtually every Allied nation at once. American, British, Canadian, French, Polish, Chinese, and Soviet forces all fielded Shermans side by side. Compare that to France at the start of the war, where nearly 80% of French tanks didn't even have radios installed, leaving crews unable to coordinate in real time with the rest of their own army, a communications gap that badly undercut France's actual tank numbers when Germany's radio-equipped, coordinated blitzkrieg tactics hit in 1940. Sheer numbers of tanks were never the whole story. How those tanks could communicate and coordinate mattered just as much as how many existed. Let's fast forward one more time into the modern era, because tank design didn't stop evolving once the big wars ended. And one of the most radical redesigns in the tank's entire history came from a country that had learned, the hard way, exactly how much a tank crew's life was worth protecting. After suffering catastrophic tank losses in the 1973 Yom Kippur War, Israel, under General Israel Tal, developed its own indigenous tank from scratch, the Merkava, meaning chariot in Hebrew, which entered service in 1979. and its most distinctive feature broke almost a century of tank design convention completely. Unlike nearly every other tank on Earth, the Merkava places its engine at the very front of the vehicle, instead of the rear. This single design choice does two things at once. First, the heavy engine block itself becomes an extra layer of protective mass, absorbing the force of a frontal hit before it can reach the crew sitting behind it. Second, moving the engine to the front frees up significant space at the rear of the tank, which the Merkava uses for a door that allows the crew to evacuate quickly under fire, or even carry wounded soldiers, supplies, or additional troops. Documented combat reports describe Merkava crews surviving penetrating hits, specifically because the engine absorbed the impact energy before it ever reached the men inside. It's a philosophy that inverts a century of conventional tank engineering, putting crew survival, not raw armor or firepower, at the very center of the design. There's an honest trade-off buried in that design too, worth mentioning. Because the engine sits up front, a solid penetrating hit to the front of a Merkava is more likely to disable the vehicle entirely than the same hit would be on a rear-engine tank, which might stay mobile even after serious front damage. Israeli doctrine treats that trade-off as acceptable. The priority has always been getting the human beings inside out alive, even if it costs the vehicle itself. It's a small design decision that says a great deal about how differently nations can choose to value the machine versus the people operating it. So, what does this whole journey add up to? It starts with a science fiction writer imagining armored land battleships more than a decade before anyone built one. It moves through a deliberately faked cover story that gave the tank its permanent name. It survives a combat debut so mechanically disastrous that fewer than 1 in 5 tanks even reached the enemy, and somehow succeeded anyway, purely through fear. It runs through the quiet, poisonous danger that early crews faced, just by sitting inside their own machine. It bends through the strange irony of an American engineer's rejected ideas, becoming the backbone of a Soviet tank that helped decide the outcome of the Second World War. It's decided, in the end, not by which side built the most brilliant machine, but by which side built the most machines. Period. And it's corrected, finally, by real data that quietly dismantles one of the most repeated myths in all of pop military history. And it ends, for now, with a small nation putting the engine where the enemy is most likely to hit. Because after enough hard lessons, survival mattered more than tradition. From a magazine story in 1903, to a battlefield in 1916, to a Soviet factory in the 1930s, to the deserts of the Middle East in the modern era, the tank has never stopped changing. Every version of it was built by people trying to solve the same brutal problem in a new way. How do you put a human being into the middle of a battlefield and give them the best possible chance of coming home? It's a story that began with a novelist imagining a way to end a stalemate, and it has never really stopped being about exactly that same problem. Trying to break a deadlock, keep an advantage, and bring people home safely, one redesign at a time. That's the real history of the tank.